Welcome back to Candid Conversations. How you doing this week, Candice?
I'm doing okay, Chris. How about you?
Oh, pretty good. Pretty good. We're back in the studio again with another great guest. Do you want to introduce them?
I will. So today we have Dale Wright is the Vice Chancellor for Advancement and Senior Vice President of the University of Illinois Foundation, developing, overseeing, and managing a comprehensive development and advancement program for the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Vice Chancellor Wright has played key roles at all levels, including roles in alumni and constituent engagement, fundraising, talent development, and overall advancement leadership. Wright is actively involved in the Council of Advancement for Support of Education, CASE, serving as a faculty member and speaker at conferences, co-chaired 2 major CASE events, and contributing to the advancement field as a member of the CASE Commission on Philanthropy and a CASE laureate, as well as a past district leader for 5 and 6. His excellence as a teacher and mentor was recognized with CASE's Crystal Apple Award for teaching. He is also the recipient of the Frank L. Ashmore Distinguished Service Award in 2025 for the U.S. and Canada. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you. Welcome to the show, Dale. We're really glad to have you here. We'd just like to jump right into questions and, tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and how you found your way into advancement in higher education.
Well, I found my way in advancement higher education like everyone else does. Accidentally, it seems, right? So I'm from Missouri, from a small town in Missouri in southeast Missouri, and I attended the University of Missouri in Columbia, Mizzou, and a first-generation college student. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I could afford to go to school there, and so that was the first big important choice. And during my undergraduate experience, I was participating in what we called student advancement programs at the time. And so the homecoming celebration was planned by a student group. Oh, okay. And it was managed through completely through the Alumni Association, which is a separate entity from the university. And that's how I got my first taste of alumni engagement and those types of things. And so while I had that experience and as I was preparing to graduate, my Alumni Association, the advisor that we worked with, let me know that he was leaving and that they were going to be looking to fill his role. And they look for someone fresher out of college because you manage a lot of student groups and alumni groups, and I applied, and that's how my career started. And it just randomly because of signing up to work on the homecoming celebration.
Yeah, and so how did those steps go? So you started off as this position, but where did you go from there?
Yeah, I started off as a coordinator of student programs for the Alumni Association. And so I worked primarily, we had 2 student groups, the Alumni Student Board and then the Homecoming Steering Committee. And then over time, I had to work with volunteers. So we had Legislative Affairs Committee, so I staffed that committee and worked a lot with our state legislature and all of that. And I did a lot in 4 years, but I was getting a little long in the tooth. And in alumni associations at the time, especially different from fundraising side, we weren't growing on the Alumni Association side. And so many people who worked in our Alumni Association, they were veterans, right, of that and been there for a while. And when I knew that nobody was planning to leave anytime soon, I knew I needed to do something a little bit different. And I was also, frankly, motivated because my now wife was at the University of Missouri and finishing up graduate school, Christina Wright, who actually works in the Geese College of Business, senior director for career and professional development. And so she was there. And so I was like, okay, she has a job full time. I need to figure out what I'm going to do. And so that's how I got my first role in development and fundraising. But oddly enough, it was a temporary position because it was during our big campaign. Okay. And it was for the provost office and areas, basically things that weren't being covered by schools and colleges. They said, this job will exist for the next 6 to 36 months, right? Okay. And I love a good timeline and a good deadline. So that's how my career started. And in about 18 months into that temporary role, I had an opportunity to be hired by the business school, actually, at the University of Missouri. Okay. And then I spent the next 10 years of my career working my way up from a development officer to the chief development officer role there before I came to Illinois now 11 years ago.
Okay. And what was the role when you came to Illinois?
My initial role was I was hired to take over the advancement program for engineering. Mm-hmm. Now the Granger College of Engineering, but just engineering at Illinois at the time. Yeah. So I was their associate dean for advancement, and I did that job for about 6 years, and then became an associate vice chancellor for development in 2021. And I worked with units like business and engineering and several other units on campus, and so was in that role. And then about a little over a year ago, was tapped on the shoulder and said, "Hey, if there's a change in the vice chancellor role, would you be willing to step in interim while we have this transition with chancellor leadership, right? Moving from Chancellor Jones to now Chancellor Isbell." And I said, "Sure, why not?" Right? I've been interim before a few times, so I did that, and then went through a national search most of last fall and earlier this year, and then was named in early 2016 and officially started in February. 2026, and officially started in February. So almost 6 months now.
So you've spent your entire career in alumni engagement and advancement. That's
fantastic. Right. Yeah. I actually like that framing too, because I think of myself as an alumni engagement officer first and foremost, right?
Awesome. So when you look back on your career that you've had and your experience, what most shaped that leadership philosophy?
So I would say a couple things. So one, I grew up in, I told you, Southeast Missouri, but my family grew up in the Delta of Mississippi. And when my parents were younger, like getting to teens, both of their families didn't know each other in the Delta, but they lived close to each other. But they all migrated to Southeast Missouri, which is where then I was born. And so I was always curious about like who we were as people, meaning Black people, right? So when I went to college, I was a biology major, but I had a minor in Black studies because I thought maybe, I don't know if I wanted to go to medical school, but I thought health and studying health disparity would be something that would be pretty interesting. So I would say that like I had the opportunity because I was in the federal work study program. So I actually got a chance to work for the first African-American professor at the University of Missouri, Dr. Arvert Strickland, who's since passed away. Yeah. And he had gone on to like academic leadership posts with the university system. And he had come back recently to do another stint as the head of the Black Studies program. So I got to be his work study student. And it was just so fascinating to just listen to his journey and what it was like to be the only one, right? Which would be really, it turned out to be really important for me because in the advancement space, it is very lonely for African Americans in leadership, particularly at big public R1 institutions, whether they be public or private, or really any institution, but certainly that's the space that I have been in. So Dr. Strickland was probably the person who just introduced me the most to learning more about my complete story, or at least setting me on the path to kind of understand my complete story. And so I would say him, although I've had lots of wonderful mentors along the way.
Yeah, who else would have been a mentor for you that kind of had a lasting influence on you?
Yeah, so early on in my career, I had a chance to work for, we called them they were the two Todds. So Todd Coleman and Todd McCubbin were both leaders in our alumni association. Todd was our executive director of the Alumni Association and vice chancellor, and Todd was a giant Todd Coleman, by the time I started working for him in the field. That's how I got introduced to CASE and like the whole volunteer leadership and thing. Todd was really involved in that and was just like, he was a kind of alumni director who I come to realize he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways, right? And then Todd McCubbin was working his way up. And so I reported to Todd McCubbin at some point in my career, and they both have continued to be really lifelong friends of mine. But they were really helpful in reminding me that the work of development is really about engagement, and it's really about understanding where somebody is in their journey, and then being able to, and willing to help them find their place, right? And whether that sometimes is like their best contributions right now is time, right? And advice. And then at some point, if they feel really good about that experience, it probably raises the likelihood of their giving philanthropically by some exponential number. Yeah.
So you mentioned early on that you got to experience being like someone that was one of only in a space. Are there any other like leadership lessons or lessons that you've learned throughout your career that still guide you today?
Yeah, I think, what was difficult about that, right, at the time, right, was coming up in Missouri, right? And so it has its own set of interesting politics at times, right? And understanding that my first sort of alumni areas were like in Southwest Missouri, and so lots of like small towns and things, and you come to realize very quickly that I'm coming there, and I may be one of the few who even come to that area, right? And I don't mean to say that in some sort of like ominous way, but it's a fact, right? And so that wasn't lost on me, and that there were times where it was funny because there were times where people just assumed that I got my job because I was on some sports team, right? So people would invent in their head that they watched me perform on some field of play during time, and this was in the late '90s, so the internet was not as much of a thing now. People wouldn't do it now because they could just look it up, right? But you had to do extra work, and so like I had to learn early on like how to navigate people crafting a story about you, but you not wanting that to like define who you are, or for somebody to come back later and say, wait a minute, I checked with somebody and you didn't play, for Norm Stewart was a legendary coach at Missouri, right? But people had, so how do you navigate, right? Sort of that thing. So like those are some of the early things where I really learned how to be, how to, like speak up for myself, but to do it in a sort of respectful manner that you hopefully didn't embarrass the other person, which is like a really important skill in our work, because we talk to people about really personal things at times around like their giving of time, talent, and treasure.
Yes.
And so you have to really kind of navigate that, right? And have to make certain that like, there's no disappointment on your face if you think I'm about to talk to Chris and his family, they're really ready. And then Chris says, oh, I was thinking about this, but we actually just got some bad news in the business, and so we're going to have to lay off some people, so I'm going to have to wait on, this pledge, or right now it's not a really good time for us. And so you have to think about, okay, well, don't betray me, right? So you sort of learn how to deal with a disappointment. You also learn how to have hard conversations, which is another important component that I tell people all the time. If they're like, hey, what's it like to work in advancement? I'm like, be prepared to have hard conversations. And if you are a conflict avoider, I'm not saying you can't be successful, but I'm telling you, you're going to add a lot of extra emotional toil and work to your everyday. So you have to actually think about that.
We're going to dive into a few questions about fundraising and philanthropy in particular, because I think there's a lot of people, even in the higher ed area, that don't really understand how it works, even though it's such a huge part of like why the university runs, because we run on the money that you all raise in many ways. So we want to ask a few questions that kind of dive into the business of fundraising. So I think a lot of people think fundraising is just about asking for money. So what misconceptions do people have about advancement work?
Yeah, so I think the framing is always probably the biggest misconception. It's like, right, so I'm not going to pretend to say like some of us in the industry, we like to say, well, I've never asked for a gift. And I'm like, well, okay, well, you use the words that lead to that. So right. But I think what they, in all seriousness, what they really mean by that is like the asking of money is really it's really a culmination of relationship building. And some of it happens really quickly, and sometimes it's initiated by you, the prospective donor. But oftentimes, more times than not, it's really a culmination of a series of events that sometimes don't work linearly, right? But they are really important, and somebody's reflecting on something, and then this thing over here seems like not connected to these other things, and then you start to have conversations, and you sort of weave through here, and then you realize, wow, we might have arrived at something where they are feeling that they want to take their relationship to the next level because they've heard about a really great program, or they like a dean's vision, or they're mad that the faculty aren't providing a deep enough experience for students, or whatever gets on their radar. And then it really becomes about, well, what kind of impact would you like to have in the short term, medium term, and long term? And then that's where you really start. So when people say, oh, I could never do what you do, I'm like, are you curious? Do you like to ask questions? Do you like to ask clarifying questions? Do you generally like to know what gets somebody excited about potentially helping someone else. If you answered yes to all or any of those questions, you might be on your way to an advancement officer or advancement role.
Yeah.
Right.
What percentage would you say like the typical fundraiser is actually having a conversation about money?
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because it's funny because like the national average for the longest time was like, okay, in a given year, I'm likely going to make like, let's just say 12 to 15 proposals in a given year. Mm-hmm. Right. And those could be the culmination of years of work, right? Yeah. So when people say, "Oh my gosh, I spent all this time asking," like when you put it in those terms, like you are asking lots of questions is what you're doing, but you might but the actual getting to the point where somebody is ready to consider and ready to really say, "Yes, this is confirming this is the kind of impact I want to have." It happens in those ways, but there's lots of ways where you're setting it up, right? Where sometimes, I'm still working with a donor right now where we started a conversation years ago, several years ago, but they were started by asking a few questions. We get them a little bit of information. Is this still the direction that they're thinking about? Then they got to go back and really, internalize it, right? And then some donors, right? You meet them in less than 4 months. You've named a college of business.
So how much of successful fundraising is relationship building versus strategy?
Yeah, so I think the relationship building is the strategy.
Okay.
Because I think sometimes I have seen this happen, and we see this in some of the trainings, right? And so we think about this all the time. We think about like, what do our teams need to be better at their jobs? And at the end of the day, it really is about relationship building. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions or things that people don't think about is how you treat individuals internally can reflect a lot about how successful you're going to be externally, right? And what I mean by that is, right, like if you have a hard time working with internal audiences that have to be there to help us be successful, right? Because like I have never awarded a scholarship, right? I've never had to run an entrepreneurship program, but I've had to try to go out and find and match donors, right, to that. So it's really important for me to really understand how that works and where can we be flexible, all those kinds of things, because I know I have to take this back and talk to a donor, and a donor sometimes wants to say, well, I think they could do this better. And it's like, I'm not going to argue with you about that, but I have to understand a little bit more about what you mean. Because when I go back to my colleague, right, the reality of it is I can't tell a dean what to do, right? I can only say, hey, here's where I think the donor is thinking about some potential conditions on a gift. We have to think this through. Does this make sense? Am I hearing them correctly? Are there suggestions that we might go in together and say, hey, we want to reframe, we want to make sure we understand that more deeply, those types of things. So I think the strategy is all about like the relationship building. So, right. So even though every gift is a transaction, doesn't mean we have to be transactional.
So what other leadership skills do you think are really important for advancement professionals? I think there's in my intersection with the advancement world, the individual fundraisers in some ways are like these individual entrepreneurs.
That's right. Yeah.
But so you almost think of them as these like solo actors out there working with their set of donors. Where does leadership intersect that?
Yeah, right. No, I think that's you make a really good observation, right? Because when I was first thinking about transitioning from alumni to development, right, I remember that we used to refer to it as going to the dark side. And I was actually like, when I used to hear it, they were using it in the context of Star Wars. I happen to be a huge Star Wars fan and nerd, right? I'm not like the Chancellor where I didn't grow up in the comics, right? But like, movies and books and things like that, I've enjoyed over the years. And so I was always like, what does that mean? Right. And it turned out that, right, that it didn't really mean anything. It just became this industry thing. But I would say, Chris, to your question, you have to be curious. We used to tell everybody, oh, extroverts, those are the only people that you have to hire, like these people who are really like outward. And it's like, sure. But if you are an extrovert, but you can't remember basic details, then that's gonna, like, over the long term, that's gonna hurt us, right?
Yeah.
So I think, I'm very curious, so I'm obviously gonna say curious. I say to my teams all the time is I'm highly process oriented. That's sort of because one of my majors in college was biology. So I'm sort of very much into systems, right? And how things process and this concept around connective tissue. So I say to folks, like, you have to figure out for you, what does curiosity for others look like for you? Because we have different personalities. I wouldn't want to hire a team full of me. We would drive each other crazy and we would all quit. Or we would know we would quit. We should quit, but we wouldn't because our pride wouldn't let us, right? So I think, I'm also highly, I'm a big eternal optimist and I'm highly enthusiastic, which is also not necessarily what everyone is. So I appreciate that, right? So I think you also have to have a little bit of a contrarian streak in that you are, like, willing to, like, not just accept everything that you hear, right?
Yeah.
And so, be like inquisitive, but not be a jerk about it, right? So I think there are lots of those, like, just interesting personality sectors where I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, we need a lot of different types of folks, right? But at the end of the day, what we need you to do when you show up is to really think about it like, I'm here to tell stories. I'm here to learn about this. And so I'm either translating the story from the university outward, or I'm translating the story of the donor back into us so I can figure out if there really is this partnership and where does it intersect in a really nice way, or where are we still veering off? Because ultimately we want to try to meet in the middle.
Yeah.
Excellent. So higher education is continuing to rapidly evolve. What opportunities do you see ahead for advancement organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most of the time I write a weekly blog. It was something that my predecessor did, and people seem to really like hearing from leadership. So it's like, I really enjoy it. And I coming back from two big industry settings. I was at Case Summit, which is sort of a big for leadership conference for mostly senior leaders and up and comers. And then I followed back up, was home for a few days, and then went to Michigan because they hosted our Big Ten development conference. And something that we recognize that we really have to sit with is the success, Chris, you highlighted this earlier, that we see in a real sense around philanthropy, I would say, on this campus over the last, like, 40 years of our history, and really the last 20 to 25. And so some places it's been much longer if you're talking about, like, particularly the Ivy Leagues. But one of the things that we talked about that we need to honestly grapple with, and I wrote a little bit about today, was what role have we played in the public's perception that higher education is not the same, doesn't hold the same value as it once did. And I think about this in terms of, at some point, we all decided that it was what we were trying to do was become the $1 billion club, meaning we were all running these $1 billion plus campaigns, right? And everybody, we were in a campaign after campaign and a campaign and all these billions of dollars, and we were starting to, really try to, we in our heads, we were saying, oh, what we're doing is we're just leveraging all this really great work that the federal government has been a part of, and state governments and foundations and these sorts of things. But, right, the reality is, did we? Like, how well did we help amplify the university's story, right? Versus just convince people that every couple of years, after an 8 to 10 year period, we just made the university X billion dollars richer. Right. And so we said, boy, we should probably be more focused on telling the complete story, because in that is a lot of different kinds of funds, and, some of it is spent as soon as it's received. Some of it is promised later. But because we have these campaign counting rules, right, we can do these types of things. It says during this period of time, these folks decided they wanted to help the university either, like, now, right, a little bit into the future, or way into the future when we think about, like, estate giving vehicles and things like that. But to the layperson, we just got, like, in the With Illinois campaign that ended 4 years ago, everyone thinks we got $2.7 billion richer, right? We did get rich in the sense that I think we grew a lot more relationships, right? Rekindled some, made some new ones, right? So like, we don't want to downplay that, but the university didn't get $2.7 billion in their coffers, and that it was all super unrestricted.
Right. So telling the story of how that money is used and how it works, and and how
the impact, and really trying to
the impact of it. Yeah.
And like what did maybe something that we did 30 years ago help us move in certain directions, right? I think there's a real opportunity for us. And the nice thing is we have records, right? So we can start to try to peel that back as to say, we know we can do this now because of these things that we did in the past that helped us learn and helped us grow. And now we can pursue this, and you can trust us because we have proof of concept.
Yeah, because there's an aspect to advancement for listeners that called stewardship, which is about making sure you're taking care of the money and doing what it was intended for after it's given. And maybe the part of that is telling that story. You may be communicating to the donor what happened, but are you communicating outward about that?
No, I think you bring up a really important point. I can tell, Chris, you're around advancement a little bit based on what I know about you personally, but that is very true, right? And also, I think we have to, stewardship and donor relations are two terms that get used really interchangeably, and oftentimes we create teams with underneath that nomenclature, right? But there's a difference between like being a steward of relationship, right, versus stewarding the dollars, or just being a donor or just relating to the donor through like the donor relations team. So one of the things that I'm trying to think about for the future is like, how are we reinforcing that we're stewarding relationships all the time? We don't have to wait until the fund agreement is signed and the money is here. Is that we actually have to think about like, how are we stewarding this connection? How are we stewarding the storytelling so that we can get to the impact, so that whenever the time is right and the liquidity or the moment has reached, now all of a sudden they're like, oh yes, the easy part is now the money, right? Because we've done all the nice hard work of saying, let's be really careful. Is this what you want to achieve? That type of thing.
Yeah. So what role do you see technology and data playing in advancement and philanthropy? Yeah.
So I've been in this is my 27th year. And I joke that when I first got started, we were still using the phone book, because while we had a database, right? Like when I was in the business school, it was sometimes much easier for me to just use the yellow pages. And, back then it was like, who's at Ernst & Young, right? And I would look in there and it's Ernst & Young, and they'd list all these numbers. And sometimes you just go down because, the data, we hadn't caught up. So sometimes that was more accurate than what number we might have had in the database, right? And then we got smart and, LexisNexis and all these things, and we started designing these things. And then a lot of folks got into our space, right? A lot of innovation was happening in our space. And so like, I think that's really important. But I think the danger that I see for us is the over-reliance on technology, and forgetting that like behind all of that technology and data and all the analytics are still people. Right? Mm-hmm. And people are far more complicated than the program. I promise you that algorithms and all these things that put and suggested that these people are in front of you, but that doesn't tell you the whole story. That helps paint sort of a picture and kind of gives you some lenses by which you might ask some early questions, but assumptions kills us in this business. And so I think we have to be really careful around like technology and data. And I say to the team all the time, one of my goals is for all of us to be more data literate and really understand, well, what is the data actually trying to tell us? Not that the data is always telling us something. Data is always telling us something, but sometimes it's just saying like, hey, here are some things you might have to explore because this is the end of what you asked me to do, I've provided for you. Now you have to kind of check that out.
Where do you see AI intersecting all of this? Because that's the hot button topic everyone wants to know about.
It really is. And so when I was at the Big Ten vice presidents meetings that we had before the conference, I was just sitting and just listening to folks. And so, some schools were talking about how they were using AI to handle a lot of like using bots for gift transactions. Right. And where right now that's still a very human, process. Yes. But they were saying, but we didn't get rid of humans. We actually the humans actually had time, because they weren't doing all this manual like processing or looking at this, and they actually had time to really help us think about like, are there themes in here that might help us think about different segmentation of our pipeline going forward, right? So we talked about that. We've seen a lot of schools talked about how they're really trying to get their teams to really utilize generative AI, but in ways that are like meant to like help them. And so a lot of schools are like doing everything from, I think it was Nebraska was talking about how they, since the university is using all these Microsoft projects, they've then worked through Copilot, and they do, it's closed loop, but they do a lot of their recording of their contact reports, and then it's sending it, filtering it right into the system, and then they can still go in and like edit it. And I'm like, yeah, that's like saving time. Yeah. And it's also giving you the chance to kind of think back, right? Because like in the meeting, you think you're doing all these things. And then for a lot of us, we still come back out and we start like writing things down in shorthand or just like trying to remember things. But like at least they're doing that, right? Yeah. So they're checking that. So I was thinking that people were saying, oh, we're going to do this for like digital gift officers. And that we are starting to see some of that in the space. And we're thinking about that in sort of a limited sense. But it really, my big takeaway was that they were trying to not make processes necessarily more efficient, but they were really looking at it from a standpoint of like, how can we truly unleash the human aspects of this work? Because that is what's so important still.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most inspiring examples that you've seen where philanthropy has directly transformed student experiences, maybe here at the University of Illinois?
Yeah. So I'll answer that one, but I will say one of my first real tastes of this when I was at the University of Missouri, and I was around like philanthropy, but I didn't realize it at the time. But in my first job, when I was with the provost office that I mentioned, I worked with a couple who lived in Kansas City, Missouri, and we still see them periodically, even now, because they have family in Chicago. So sometimes they will stop through and say hello. But we were working with them, and they were really interested at the time in a lot of the diversity programming that the university was doing. Because if you know the history of the University of Missouri, it was even after, right, segregation had ended, and those sorts of things, that the University of Missouri, it took a famous Supreme Court case, the Lloyd Gaines case, to finally integrate the University of Missouri 100 years after its founding, right? Like, so think about that.
Yeah.
And then, unfortunately, Mr. Gaines disappeared before he, on his way to come to school at the University of Missouri, and then it took another 15 years before the first Black student like actually showed up on campus, right? So they had followed this, and the alum of the couple, he had been on campus in the 60s, and so that was an interesting time, right? And so he always thought about that experience, and so they had a small business that they had built into a success, and had been following what leadership was talking about, and they were finally felt like they were at a place where they could start to have their philanthropy support the institution. And they had lots of different interests. And it was really interesting because I did a presentation with this donor years ago, and we talked about the fact that I was like the 13th or 14th development professional that had called on them in a 5-year or so period, right? Because they would write an annual giving check, I kid you not, and they would write a letter. And they would say, we're writing this in support of this effort. We would like to learn more in case there's more we could do. And then sometimes people would go and meet with them, and they would have surface level conversations, and it wouldn't quite matter. And then those folks would go away. And then the thing about it is we get you into our system, and then as technology improves, we start learning all other kinds of things about you because we subscribe to these different databases. And anyway, we learned that they liked the music and the symphony and things. So at some point, people from the School of Music started calling on them. And it's like this whole thing. And so anyway, when I finally met them, because of my role in the Alumni Association, I was used to putting together reports on, because the Legislative Black Caucus at the time wanted to know, right? You've been in a consent decree with the Department of Education. What are you doing to improve the quality of life for all your students, particularly at the time African-American students, because that was what the consent decree was about. So anyway, we started talking, and we started saying, well, what matters to you? And you learn that this gentleman was like Phi Beta Kappa when he was undergrad, and that wasn't really something that was in the notes that was captured ever. And said, okay, well, we have this honors college, and the honors college director had been wanting to try to get more African American students and other students of color to think about the honors college as a part of their overall experience. But many, like first gen folks, we are like, I'm already in college. What is the honors college? Do I have to do more work? That sort of thing. And so we worked for about a year and a half and came up with a really cool program where they wanted to help provide full ride scholarships after students had received their traditional aid. But they also added in study abroad opportunity for those same students, right? And then my wife at the time was in the honors college, and she ran some interesting programs for freshmen to get them exposed to research as undergraduates. So then they added that in there. So like all of a sudden, they created a cohort of scholars who had all of these different sorts of experience. And that was every year was always really fun to meet the families and to be at a dinner with the donors and for the students for it to dawn on them to say, wow, not only is this, this helping cover my education, right, above after this aid, I also have an opportunity to go study abroad. And this money largely pays for it, so I don't have to dip into my other aid. And I get to learn whether I want to do research or not. As I come in as a freshman, I'm going to get paid for it. So that was how we enticed the faculty, because the gift provided some support for that. So that was kind of fun. But like here at Illinois, one of my favorite things is, I don't know if you've spent much time on engineering campus, but recently civil engineering had a renovation. And so they had this bridge that connects the Yay Student Center building, right? And they call it their Civil Engineering Modernization Lab, and it connected to another lab. And there's this bridge. But did you know that the bridge is actually a living laboratory?
No, I did not.
not.
That donors, Lana Ball and his wife Kavita made a lead gift. And so that bridge, they actually use it. So if you walk across that bridge at times, you may say they may say, hey, you see those colors? We need you to step only on those colors all the way across this bridge. Or throughout the day, they can test different tension and different loads. And so most people just think, oh, this is like a cool little bridge in between the places or whatever, but it's actually a living laboratory.
The more you know.
Right?
That's
and so
story.
that's what I love about what we could do, because it wasn't like we set out to say, hey, donors, you've been really good supporters of us. Would you like to do this bridge? Because right.
Yeah.
So that's one of my. I mean, I've worked on a lot of fun things, but I love watching people's reaction when you're like, "What? That's elaborate. That's
a cool story."
Yeah. So now you want to go
over there.
I know. I was just like,
we're gonna go right after.
Yeah. You know what? You got to do this from there.
So let's circle back to your leadership and what do you hope people say about your leadership when you're not in the room?
Yeah, well, so what I hope that people will say, frankly, is that advancement is fun and advancement is for everybody, right? Because I really want people to listen, I make no bones about it, right? These can be tough negotiations, right? We're talking about people's resources, right? And they've got families and they've got all these things, right? So I don't make light of that. But I say, what I love about this work and what I hope people get from me from this work, when I'm not in the room, is that the greatest thing that we can do for people is to remember to help them keep dreaming. And I think that's what the heart of philanthropy, when we get it right, what we're really doing is a lot of dream casting, right? And really kind of exploring it through that lens. Now we have lots of needs, right? We're trying to figure out how do we replace federal research and those types of things. So we have to be really careful about it's not that we can do that, right? Because if the federal government was providing hundreds of millions of dollars, in a space that has been traditionally their lane, then it's not that easy to think that we can just talk to our donors, even if we're the best storytellers in the world, and get them to just want to, switch on a dime, right? So we have to be really thoughtful. So I hope that people really get a sense that this is This is really great work, right? And it's not hard work, it's heart work, right? It's really about meeting people where they are. And I don't, right? And then this is also me being like, I'm like Mr. Eternal Optimist, that like, regardless of what people's motivations are, like tax-wise, that at the end of the day, they still, right? They could choose, like, we don't really help people with their tax situation because there's plenty of nonprofits. There's thousands of nonprofits probably within this community that could satisfy if that was really what somebody was seeking, right? So we have to think about this in terms of, that might be a byproduct of this process, but what we're really trying to do is get to the core of what people want to see happen.
So the challenge is really aligning all of these individual dreams of individual donors with what we're trying to do at the university, right? And bringing that all together. So it's an alignment challenge.
It really, it is, because there are times where you're like, wow, we could really use this money, but is this aligned in a way that allows us to be who we are supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And be authentic, and that we can steward it, and over the long term, or be able to have enough belief that if we need to pivot, we can pivot.
Yeah, it takes a strategic, creative person. So if you could leave our listeners, we're going to get close to wrapping up. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of leadership advice that has consistently served you throughout your career, what would it be?
Wow. One piece of advice. So I was a big, I don't listen to as much like rap as I like used to, right? Mm-hmm. But I remember, and I'm a big movie fan, right? So I remember like Scarface, right? Like never get high on your own supply, and then later on Biggie Smalls like put it in a song, and everybody was like, "What? This is amazing, right?" So I think like that's actually sort of been part of my own journey, right? Like, I mean, if you think about my background, right? The people in my town, if I would have said growing up, I'm gonna one day go and be a vice chancellor at a major university, right? Everyone would have said, "What? Nobody." First of all, no one from our area goes to college, right? And all of that, right? So I think I'm reminded of that, of being just like the need to be humble and to count your blessings, and also make yourself available, for those blessings. And the last thing I would say is that in recent years, in the last probably 10-ish years, the thing that has stuck with me the most is like, so people on my team know this, but I like big fan of Martin Luther King Jr. Like I have books, I've read books on his speeches, autobiographies and things. And one of his lasting sermons is called The Drum Major Instinct. And I listen to this multiple times a year and or read it because it defines how I want to be as a leader. And it's what you think of, right? It's talking about like this drum major instinct, which is this desire to be out front, the desire to lead the parade, that sort of thing. And King is actually making an argument that that's a good thing if you harness it correctly, right? Like, because we all need that, and we all need that part. All of us have it in us. Some of us are just more comfortable with it, but oftentimes that excess can also lead to abuse of power and leadership and those types of things. So like that also sticks with me and grounds me and reminds me about like that that servant in front of leader is intentional.
Yeah. So we always end these conversations with the same question, and it's in the spirit of Candid Conversations. What's one thing that most people don't know about you that you'd be comfortable sharing today?
Yeah, I always think that people don't know that I have a twin sister, and I also have twin children, right? And but then everyone's like, everybody knows you have a twin sister, so right. But so one of the things that is I enjoy singing, and in college I was actually in a gospel choir, and we would go and perform at university events, at local events, regional events, and so I really enjoy that part of my college experience, and I didn't know that it even existed. And then a bunch of my friends and I stumbled into the Baptist Student Union one day and joined the choir.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. We've had quite a few singers.
I know. We're going to have a recap and have everybody submit their singing.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
Yeah.
But I've not been brave enough to go to Dr. Ollie while Stevenson and try to move my course. I know they do, but I'm like, are all these people going to look at me because I sing differently? I know it's a chorus, but you got to try out first, right? So maybe one of these days.
So I'm gonna throw one last question in here, and it might be the hardest question that we've thrown at you today.
Okay.
You're a Mizzou grad. Mm-hmm. You work for the Illini. Who do you root for in the bragging rights game?
Oh no! You better say the right
thing. It's actually really funny. So last December. Mm-hmm. was the first time I'd gone to the game.
Oh, that was your first bragging rights game?
That was my first bragging rights game because I was just like too nervous. But I was there and I knew a bunch of my Mizzou friends were going to be there. So I took a lot of selfies of me and decked out in my orange and blue and I could see them and they could see me. And we were like, it was like some friendly banter. I think the further I'm away from, my alma mater, like I used to joke that, my first 15 years of my career, I never got to really experience what it was like to be an alum, right?
Right.
And so now I'm sort of enjoying being just sort of like, away from it. And then of course, Illinois has just been lots of fun for our family and stuff. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's a fair question, but everyone's like, really? I'm like, yeah, it was hard. When I first got here, it was much harder than it is now.
All right, go Illini. All right, thank you so much, Dale, for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure. I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.